When you picture a medieval peasant, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably mud, misery, and just non-stop back-breaking work. But what if I told you that picture is missing some huge, and I mean huge, pieces of the puzzle? Let's dive in and see if the life of a medieval peasant was actually, in some pretty surprising ways, better than you might think.
Yeah, this is the classic image, right? You're at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. You're tied to the land you work on, and your chances of ever moving up in the world, pretty much zero. It's that grim, familiar stereotype we've all heard.
Okay, but here's the twist. What if, despite all of that, the average medieval peasant actually had way more time off than the average worker today? I know, it sounds crazy. Let's unpack that, because it's a claim that pretty much turns our whole understanding on its head.
To really get their life, you first have to understand their world. And for a peasant, their entire world was the manor. It was the social, economic, and political hub for, well, everything.
So what does that actually mean? The manorial system was basically a form of feudalism where peasants worked land that was owned by a lord, maybe a noble or even a bishop. The manor itself, with its church, its mill, and all the farmland, was designed to be totally self-sufficient. It was the heart of rural life.
And the land itself was organized in a really interesting way. You had some land that was farmed just for the lord's family and his household. Then you had plots for the serfs, who basically paid their rent with their labor or a chunk of their harvest. And then you also had land for free peasants, who just had to pay rent. So it wasn't just one single system, but this mix of different duties and obligations.
And this points to a completely different mindset. See, unlike the massive Roman Empire that came before, which was all about trade, the manor was all about community and taking care of your own. The goal wasn't to grow a bunch of extra stuff to sell in some faraway market. It was to feed everyone who lived right there.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. What did the work actually look like? Well, a peasant's entire year was completely dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. Now, this is a really key detail. You didn't have these neat, fenced-in farms like we picture today. Instead, you had these huge, wide-open fields, and each peasant family would farm maybe a dozen or so narrow strips of land scattered all over the place. This meant you had to cooperate with your neighbors.
So, what were they growing? It was mostly grains. Rye, wheat, barley, oats, these were the absolute staples that made up most of their diet and took up most of their farming efforts. Legumes like peas and beans were also super important, with a smaller bit dedicated to fruits.
And to plow all that land, they relied on good old-fashioned animal power. Oxen and horses were basically the medieval tractors doing all the heavy lifting. In fact, their plowing techniques were so intensive that they created these long ridges and furrows that you can still see in the British countryside today. It's like a lasting monument to all that hard work.
And they were also surprisingly clever farmers. Without any modern science, they figured out this amazing three-field rotation system. They'd plant grains in one field, legumes, which actually help put nutrients back into the soil, in another, and they'd leave a third field completely empty to rest. It was a brilliant way to keep the land productive year after year.
All right, we've covered the work. Now for the part that might seriously blow your mind. All the time they weren't working.
The biggest reason for this is super simple. Farming is seasonal. I mean, once the harvest was in and the fields were prepped for next year, there was just a lot less to do. Winter was a kind of forced downtime, a time to rest, mend your tools, not for some endless grind.
But it wasn't just winter. Sundays were always a day of rest for church. And then you had dozens of mandatory church holidays, which is, by the way, where we get our word holidays. Add to that time off for big community events like births and weddings, or even when some traveling entertainers rolled through town. These weren't just days off. They were huge community parties that brought everyone together.
So, what does this all add up to? Well, get ready for this. Scholars estimate that a medieval peasant could have had anywhere from 50 to as many as 150 days off per year. That's almost a third of the year. That's potentially way more vacation time than a lot of us get today. Pretty wild, right?
And let's not forget the other side of the deal. In exchange for all their labor, peasants lived under the military protection of their lord and his knights. In a world that was often dangerous and pretty uncertain, that kind of security was a really big deal.
So let's put it all together. What does this actually mean for us today? Let's do a quick side-by-side comparison.
This table really highlights the trade-offs, doesn't it? Compared to a modern worker, the peasant probably paid lower taxes and lived under a much weaker central government. They had this incredibly strong, tight-knit local community, but the trade-off was they had almost no chance to change their station in life.
We have way more freedom to move up, but often a more scattered community and a much stronger state to answer to.
And that brings us right back to our central idea. As the source material puts it, even though they were at the bottom of the pile, they had rights, they had protection, and they had a surprising amount of time away from work. It was a hard life, absolutely no question, but it wasn't only a hard life.
So I'll just leave you with this question to chew on. We've gained so much: freedom, technology, comfort. But in making that trade, have we lost something? More free time, a stronger local community. Was the peasant's life, in its own way, simpler and maybe even a little bit better? It's definitely something to think about.